ज्ञानतिमिरन्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकाय चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। नमो विष्णुपदाय कृष्णप्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्त स्वामी नित्यानन्दे। नमस्ते सरस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य सुधारिणे। वंशकल्पातरुभ्यश्च कृपा सिन्धुभ्य एव च पतितानां पावनेभ्यो वैष्णवेभ्यो नमो नमः। श्रीकृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर श्रीवासुदेव गौर भक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे। I'm very honored and grateful to be with all of you this evening. Special gratitude for Mr. Shan, dear friend, esteemed scholars for being with us. Thank you for your kind introduction. All of you. Thank you very much. We were asked to speak briefly on the subject of how spiritual life has a relevant importance within the modern world. It's incredible how things change. Today, with the various conflicts due to greed, sectarianism, pollution, it's a very exciting opportunity to really be instruments of powerful change. And from a spiritual perspective, that change, in order for it to be substantial, it has to begin within ourselves. Albert Einstein said that we cannot solve today's problems by using the same awareness that caused them. And this is an age-old challenge. How to actually change our consciousness. In the early days, thousands of years ago, in India and other places, scriptures were sketched into palm leaves. And it was extremely rare to get something like that. And the only way people would learn was holy people would just walk along dusty pathways with a little bag of these palm leaves and go town to town, village to village and teach people. That was the only access there was. And there was tremendous transformations in society. How things have changed. Just yesterday I was with my father. He's 89 years old. And he was telling me in his childhood there was no such thing as television. To make a phone call, you'd have to go to the corner drugstore and turn a crank. And then you get an operator and you tell her where you want to call. And for a local number, she would have to take a cord and push it into the hole where that phone number was. Just in one lifetime, what's happened to this world? Now with satellite TV, with internet, with telecommunications, with cellular phones, it's absolutely incredible what technology has done. And this technology could be utilized for very, very positive purposes. But a serious question that I think we all have to really ask is there a need to step back and see what's really happening to the values of the human consciousness? I recently saw an article in a health journal which explained the number one cause now of injury-related deaths in America is suicide. It has actually gone beyond automobile accidents, which is number 2. And number 3 is drug-related deaths. With all that we have, depression, suicide, anxiety. And not long ago in Wall Street, there was such a trauma that affected the economies all over the world. And so much of it, the cause was greed. Greed by people who had everything materially that people could possibly dream of. They weren't satisfied. And in the global community we're living in today, even in the name of religion, which is supposed to actually solve these problems, it so often becomes the biggest problem because of sectarian conceptions, where spirituality, instead of cleaning the effects of arrogance, superiority complex, it becomes a weapon to serve the ego in the name of God. In the 1960s, when I was a student, like many of you, of course I only made it through one semester of college before I took my journey to the East. I kind of never came back. But we had our challenges then. Pretty much the same as now, but just in different forms. In the 1960s, from Illinois near Chicago, there was tremendous social unrest because of civil rights. It just didn't make sense to me. My father was a struggling middle-class person who went through bankruptcy twice. But still, somehow or other, we had what we needed. But just a few miles away, in the ghettos of Chicago, people who had a different color skin, they were in poverty. And although the U.S. Constitution and all we learned in schools was teaching us that there's freedom and justice for all, there was no equal opportunity for such people. If you're born in the ghetto, it's 95% you will live and die in the ghetto. So much prejudice. Didn't make sense. And some of my best friends persecuted for that. Martin Luther King, in one speech he said that the irony of our times is we have guided missiles and misguided humanity. At the same time, there was a Vietnam War going on. A war that really didn't make any sense whatsoever. But yet, when we turn 18, if we're drafted, we have two choices. Go to war or go to jail. It was serious. When things are really right in your face, you have to take it seriously. It's not just some ideology that you may not believe in that somebody else is dealing with. These were real factors. And so many of my brothers and sisters at that time, we were demonstrating. Some were killed, beaten by the police who were supposed to be protecting our freedom. It was a serious times. And in my own life, I just couldn't go along with such apparent contradiction and hypocrisy. So I joined the counterculture. But then, as time went on, I realized that the same disease that the counterculture was fighting against, we had it. We just had a different hairstyle and a different dress style and different music. And then I realized the only real solution has to be changing our own hearts. The world needs compassion. The world needs to see the universal spirit of how life is sacred in whatever form it takes. I remember once I was speaking to the Minister of the Environment for India, and she challenged me, Maneka Gandhi, what are you holy people, you sadhus, doing for the environment? The rivers are polluted, the oceans are polluted, the earth is polluted, the air is polluted, and you're sitting around and chanting and meditating, praying. What are you doing? She was an activist. I was actually very thrilled with enthusiasm. And a little crowd was gathered around. I was just sitting in an airport, trying to mind my own business. And I expressed my thoughts that if we don't go to the root of the problem, and we only deal with the symptoms, then we're not making a very lasting solution. It's like if there's boils in the body due to a blood disease. It's necessary that we deal with the boil, like putting some salve and compress, whatever. But however many times we do that, there'll be more and more and more boils coming unless we go to the root cause, purifying the blood. So what is the root cause of all these problems in this world? The pollution of the air and the sky and the earth is simply a manifestation of the pollution within our hearts. Greed, arrogance, insatiable passions for power, for wealth, envy, anger, so many illusions. And universally, spirituality is meant to clean our hearts. My Guru Srila Prabhupada used to say, spirituality, real religion, is not about being a Hindu or a Muslim, a Christian, a Jew, a Parsi, a Jain, a Sikh, Muslim. It's about cleaning the heart. It's about building a true foundation within ourselves. foundation that we build our life upon, a foundation of inner fulfillment, a foundation of compassion, a foundation of love for God, and seeing the sacredness of life everywhere. Lord Chaitanya, one of our great avatars, he taught Amani Namana Dena, that true culture is the capacity to offer honor and respect to the living force within every living thing. To clean our hearts of this dirt. The explanation, Cheto Darpana Marajanam Bhava Mahatavagina Bhavana, that the mind is like a mirror. And if the mirror is covered with dust, we can't see ourselves. All we see is the dust. But if we clean the mirror, we see ourselves. Who are we? The Bhagavad Gita explains, Vajayate Mriyate Bhaktapacha, that we are all living forces. We are all spiritual sparks. We're part of God. Seeing through the eyes and hearing through the ears and tasting through the tongue and thinking through the brain. And the nature of that living force is Satchidananda, eternal, full of knowledge and full of happiness. And that happiness, its essence, is love. To love and to be loved. And the origin of that love is the nature of the eternal soul's love for God. And when that love is awakened within ourselves, there's such deep fulfillment that we can actually see a part of God in everyone. And there's love. Human evolution is going beyond the obsessive need to take things, to finding the true pleasure of giving, seva, unselfish service. And when we develop that foundation by simply awakening this essence within ourselves, then our integrity will not be compromised by temptations or fear. Then we can actually see everything in relationship to the love we discover within ourselves. That's the principle of real spirituality. And that's the age-old universal solution if we actually follow our spirituality for that purpose. Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. I'll just tell one little story. One time, I was sitting on the bank of a river Ganges, and this hawk, gigantic hawk. I'm thinking of this story because Professor Chan was just telling me about his visit to Ethiopia, where instead of seeing sparrows flying around at sunset, there's hundreds of eagles. They're soaring through the air. And there was this very large hawk. Wings were expanded. He was getting flying lower, lower, lower until he was just a few feet above my head. I was all alone. I was getting a little worried as I looked up his very sharp beak, sharp claws. It was big, and I'm pretty small. And suddenly, he dove right in the river. And he went underwater. So, splashes and splashes and splashes, and I'm watching. And he emerged from under the water with a fish in his claws, flapping desperately. At the beginning, I was kind of thinking, I'm kind of glad it's him instead of me. then I kind of transcended that human reaction. And I looked at that little fish, because it was only a few feet away from me, and his eyes were so bewildered. And he was absolutely shocked at me. He was flapping in desperation. And the hawk took the fish higher and higher and went off into the forest. And I was thinking that fish was obviously just going about its day like any other day. Swimming upstream, downstream, probably with friends and family members, playing, looking for food, whatever else fishes do. So many fish means they think of other stuff too. But just going about its day, when suddenly the hawk obeyed, lifted out of its complacency. And then I was thinking, television. We learn about it from living friends and loved ones. How at any moment things could change. We shouldn't be complacent. We should be alert. If that fish was swimming deeper, the hawk could not touch it. And similarly, if we go deeper into ourselves, if we develop that spiritual foundation that is inherent within all of us, then whatever may happen in the world, it cannot disturb our integrity, our dignity. It cannot disturb our peace and our love for all beings, for God. And that potential is within all of us. And in these modern days where there are so many problems ecologically, economically, in religions, on practically every level, the real revolution is the revolution within. In my own tradition, we chant God's names and try to live with character for the purpose of cleaning the mirror of our heart and going deeper and deeper. And students are the future of the world. And it's really the time when this internal revolution can have a powerful effect on us, our colleagues as well. I thank you very much. Such an honor to be with Professor Chan.
It's my honor to be with you, Swami. Whenever I hear you speak, I feel profoundly moved. And one of the questions that always comes to my mind is whether or not I have in some way taken a wrong path in my life. Because we have many similarities of background. We're both children of the 60s. And in the demonstrations of the 60s, then I also was a street fighting man. The police and I did not get on very well at all. And I also took myself off to wander in different parts of the world, eventually fetching up here in this country. Most of my early years, late 20s, throughout most of my 30s, I was involved in peacekeeping work in the conflicts of Africa. And it was only after that that I became an academic and eventually wound up here at SOAS. And I'm very much reminded of this not only because of continuing violence in not just Africa but many countries of the world today, but just this last weekend. It was a very peculiar reunion of a number of people that I'd known when they too were younger. And these had been guerrilla fighters from various liberation struggles in Africa. And we all met at the Radhanath Villa in Lake Como. There was a special meeting arranged just so that these people could get together again. Many of them I've seen many, many years ago when they were still in camouflage fatigues, still fighting, still struggling for something. We probably left them very little time for spiritual people. Now the more young ministers and messages and stuff, the worldly stuff could be regarded as very successful. And yet they're consumed by the struggle to find something, or consumed by an inner struggle of somehow keeping their integrity and not becoming corrupt, which is so easy to do in many of these situations. Some of them feel that they've been successful or on the path to success, and many of them are fully able to admit that they've been failures. But I'm wondering how one reconciles lives like that with the kinds of lives that we're talking about in terms of being able to dedicate ourselves, our consciousness, to polish the mirror of our minds and our hearts for the sake of inner peace, and to spread the message, the whole ethos of non-corruption in the world, starting with ourselves. How possible it is, if you are involved in the great struggles of the world, to keep the mirror free of dust, not to mention free of so many other things. And I wanted to make these comments at the very beginning to try to introduce some conversation precisely about this. The students here at SOAS come from 120 nationalities, and that's a pretty high percentage of nationalities for such a small university. And traditionally, they've always been, Swamiji, very much involved in the great issues of the day. They're idealistic. They want to become better people in exactly the way that you suggested, that each of us should try to become a better person. But they also want to become involved in the struggles of the world because they see injustice. And so the compassion that they direct outwards, I wonder to what extent that corrupts the possibility of development inwards. And I think that's a tension that all of us have to face in life. I think that one of the great things that I really, really admire about the Krishna consciousness people is precisely because, despite how many people view the Krishna consciousness people, they're actually always involved in some kind of outward manifestation of trying to assist and to be very, very actively compassionate to others in the world. The example of the feeding of people in Indian cities, hundreds of thousands of plates of food on a daily, if not millions on a weekly basis. That kind of outreach, I think, is vitally important. But is it possible to do that kind of outreach, that kind of compassionate outreach, when the situation is something which is almost certainly going to compromise you? I'm thinking of a particular assignment I had at the end of the Eritrean War for liberation. There are two very, very moving experiences when I went to Eritrea to help with the reconstruction there. This was in the early 1990s. And you'll remember that Bob Geldof's Live Aid had taken place in 1984, the great Ethiopian famine, which had affected not just Ethiopia, but Eritrea and very, very large parts of Sudan as well. And I was by the port city of Makawa, which had been totally destroyed by air attacks. And there was not a stone standing on a stone. It was just total devastation. And so I went to the Red Sea, feeling very, very depressed about all of this. And a young boy fell in step with me, and he spoke a bit of English and asked where I had come from. And I said I'd come from England. And he said, I hear that 8 years ago, when we had the great famine here, there was a singer in your country who tried to help us. And it got me thinking about ways of trying to help. All of us know Bob Geldof was a loudmouth, sort of rabble-rousing, very bad-mannered, very bad rock musician. But all the same, did something very, very positive.
trying to reach out to others. But in doing so, also compromised himself, I feel, in terms of the associations he made with the rich and the great and the powerful and the politically strong of the world. In order to try to help other people, he tried to get money and political support from those whom I would regard, and I think most of my students regard, as deeply compromised individuals. And that's a contradiction, I think, that has to be grappled with as we try to exercise compassion, a form of spiritual quality in today's material world. How do we address that contradiction? The other thing that most alarmed me on that particular visit was I was taken to visit an execution ground where it was my job to count how many bodies were at that point in time still unburied. And don't forget, the war had just come to an end. So I counted 600 bodies. And what alarmed me was not the bodies or the counting of the bodies, but by how uncaring and jaded I'd become by the end of that exercise. Driving back up the hills to Asmara, the capital city in the mountains of Eritrea, I was asking myself very deep questions. Why do this? How can you do things like this and still maintain a compassion? Or should you not do this and not risk losing your compassion in the first place? So, Swamiji, I was wondering, given exactly the things that you're talking about, the violence in the world today, the great difficulties that plague young people all around the world, given the idealism that young people here at SOAS feel towards all of these things, what would you advise them to avoid being torn by trying to do something which will compromise their compassion? And how to keep their compassion? And is it possible to keep compassion by keeping aloof from the great struggles of the world? To what extent can you develop yourself as a compassionate and a spiritual human being while being involved in these struggles to try to do something better for other people in the world? I wonder whether I could start my interview by asking you a difficult question, but one which I'm sure resonates in the minds of all of my young friends here. Insightful words.
One time, a PhD student working on a thesis was interviewing my guru, Srila Prabhupada. And he was challenging the nature of the compassion of today's world. It was a long talk, but at one point she tried to change the subject and said, "Could I ask you a philosophical question?" And Prabhupada said that without good character, philosophy has little or no meaning whatsoever. That the beginning of humanity, really, true humanity, is our character. Character means transformation, from arrogance to humility, from greed to generosity, from hate to love, from vengeance to forgiveness. These are universal principles. And so often today, even in the name of religion and high spiritual philosophy, there's very little character. The world needs this character. In for that character to actually be able to withstand the temptations and the fears that will inevitably come to us, we need a strong internal foundation. And that's where the need for spiritual life is. But at the same time, especially in modern times, the greatest service that we can do, and one of the greatest purifications for our own self, is to be an activist. To be willing to take risks. To be willing to actually extend ourselves as instruments of compassion, of instruments of change. So I would say, Professor Jan, that balance is required. The balance of activism within the world, and at the same time, that cultivation of the inner strength, the inner integrity, and ultimately connecting with that grace that is beyond our own intelligence and beyond our own powers, to be instruments of peace and love. Just like when we work, somehow or other we find time to eat, and we have time to sleep. Because if we don't do that, we're not going to be able to do our work much better. If we think that if we just eat and sleep and don't do any work, then that's not very progressive. And if we just do work and think that, eating and sleeping is just a waste of time, what is going to be our sustenance? So to harmonize the activism of our service to this world with that internal cultivation of virtue is what really the world needs, and what each of us could choose to live by.
Swamiji, how should we do this? I'm thinking about a talk I heard once by the Chinese film director Ang Lee. He made the film Crouching Tiger and Hidden Dragon, which was a very balletic film, and a very, very unusual one for its time. But he was asked what his philosophy of life. He said he was a Taoist, a Chinese form of meditation and development very closely aligned with nature. But he said that it's time that we were able to develop in today's world an industrial Tao. That is no use learning to meditate in mountains and by streams if you can no longer relate to the environment that most people have to live in. And to be spiritual, and to be spiritual and meaningful, that is meaningful to other people way today, you have to have an industrial Tao. So the question that comes to mind is in trying to cultivate oneself and trying to find this balance that we were talking about. What about the temptation? This is in fact the temptation to remove ourselves from the scene of action, to take ourselves to a peaceful place, far away from where anything troublesome or difficult might happen. Is there a way to be able to develop an industrial spirituality, as it were, in today's very, very difficult and industrial world?
Technology, science, the products of industry are actually neutral. Their benefit or their destructive powers depend on our consciousness. An example is given of a knife. Is a knife good or bad? If it's in the hands of a thief, that thief will kill someone to get money. If the same knife is in the hands of a surgeon, that knife will save somebody's life. So the things of this world, whatever they may be, their value is in the consciousness of who's using. I remember when I was writing this book, The Journey Home, I wanted to go back into some of the places I lived 35 years before to get a view of memories. So I went up to the Himalayan jungles, just north of Rishikesh, where I lived with one yogi in a cave, in a deep jungle. So when I went to the cave, I found there was about 4 or 5 little caves and one big one. And I was a student, so I lived in one of the little ones. And the guru lived in a big one. They were nice caves. His cave was a 5-star cave. Ours were like 2 stars. But I went to a cave and it was boarded off. And there was a big lock on it. And it said, trespassers will be prosecuted. This was very different. So I was just kind of sitting there wondering what happened. And then this one yogi, long matted hair, just had one little strip of cloth around his loins, barefoot. It's a real traditional looking yogi. He came to me and said, "You're not allowed in this cave." I said, I understand. I said, "Why?" And he explained that the government forest department evicted all the yogis from their caves because they want to develop it for tourism. So all these yogis were evicted. And there was a court case. And then he looked at me and said, "But do you want to see my cave?" And I said, "Yeah." So he started barefoot, and he's an elderly man, but he's just jumping over these mountains, and I'm climbing up with him. I had somebody with me who could translate. And he had a really nice cave, a little altar, a little fire pit for a sacred fire, and everything was there. And outside of his cave, he had a disciple constantly reading the Bhagavad Gita out loud. And he was just showing me around. And I asked him, "How is it that you're allowed to live in your cave when everybody else was evicted?" He told me that he made a deal with the government. That he's an informer. That he every day spends a couple hours walking through the jungle, and if any other yogi tries to live in any cave, he informs the government and they go and arrest him. And for that service, he's allowed to stay in here. So I was thinking this was interesting. And then I went to the main disciple of this person who I used to live with, and I asked him, "Where's our guru? Where is your guru?" And he said that years ago, he was starting to get popular, and people were coming through the jungle to see him. And there was another yogi in another cave who couldn't tolerate people coming to see this person instead of him. So one day, when this yogi who was getting popular was taking water from a stream, the other yogi shot him in the back and killed him. It's yogis. Politics from not yogis. And when I was talking to this disciple, he was in a government guest house, which was, when I lived him, he was living in a jungle cave, and now he's in this government guest house in a storage room. And he was just sitting on a wooden bed, and all around him was piles and piles and piles of stuff, blankets and pots, and it was just stuff. And I asked him, "What is all this stuff?" And he said that all the other caves who got evicted, they all brought all their stuff and put them in this room. And I said, well, why do you have this room? And he said, because I'm fighting the forest department in the courts. And I have a lawyer. And the lawyer told me that, I have to be prepared to go to court whenever the dates are there. And I saw there was all kinds of people from America and Germany and Israel and everywhere from England in this hotel, and they were playing music and they were doing it, and this poor yogi sitting there. And all of a sudden I heard this music. I'm from the 60s, I'm not used to some of this modern music. I kind of lived in caves for a long time myself. It was like it was very loud. And I was thinking, this poor yogi, he was living with, to the sounds of birds and crickets and those. And it just kept going. And I was thinking, to fight a court case, he's here. And as the music was blaring, he reached over into the room full of stuff. Do you like this story? And he picked up an old burlap bag with a rope on the top of it, and he untied it. Then he reached in the bag, and there was this plastic bag. It was really old and shriveled up, and it was knotted on the top. And he untied it, and meanwhile, and he reached in the bag and pulled out a cell phone. And he put it to his ear and answered, Om Namah Shivaya. It was his lawyer. And I asked him, why do you have that ringer on your cell phone? And he said, the person who gave me the cell phone was my lawyer. He was from Delhi. And he said, there's a menu of different types of ringers. What would you like? And he was going through the list. And he came to the selection trance. And the yogi said, that is the goal of yoga, trance. So he said it and left. And after he was gone, he didn't realize what trance music actually meant. But anyways, I'm sorry for the long answer, but even if you're living in the caves of the Himalayas, still envy and greed and all of this stuff could be there, even violence. And I know people in New York City and London and Bombay who have families, who work in business, who are very, very pure, saintly people. So our spirituality is not so much a matter of changing our location, it's a matter of changing our hearts. Because there's disturbance everywhere.
I think that was a very, very fantastic answer. Swamiji, do you understand that in today's music there's something called bass rapping, which means that you manipulate the microphones and make exactly the kinds of noises that you were just making. So I could get you a very good commercial lawyer and get you Ladies and gentlemen, I think that what we should do right now is to open the floor to you. And if you've got any questions that you want to ask Swamiji, you should feel very, very free to ask your questions. Can I have some hands of anybody who wants to start the ball rolling? A gentleman at the back there.
I was just wondering the extent to which there was any virtue in someone who does choose to go out and not have any relevance with what we call the industrialized world, and actually just go out and live entirely in a cave, not to transform themselves and come back and do good, but to stay out and die like that. I'm just wondering, is there any virtue in doing that?
According to our Vedic tradition, there's two types of serious spiritual practitioners. One is a bhajananandi, which is a person who withdraws from the world so that he or she in a holy place, in a monastery or ashram, is completely away from the greed and the competition and the egoism of the world, to give their lives only to prayer, to chanting God's names, and to spiritual practice in that way. Of course, sometimes the same types of problems in a micro setting are there too. I've seen in ashrams and monasteries, usually people have to deal with the same kind of stuff in principle as we're dealing with in the cities, just in another dress. But that's a bhajananandi, and some people just go off alone. And such persons, if they do it right, can actually attain that love of God, that liberation. And the other type of person is a gostiyanandi, a person who makes that balance of giving proper time each day to one's own spiritual practice, to actually connect with that grace, with that power, with that foundation within ourselves, and then to go out and seva, unselfish service, whether we're a doctor or a lawyer or a professor, or whether we're a swami or an industrialist or a business person or a software engineer, to actually perform our duty as an expression of that grace that we're connecting with inside, rather than just an obsession to get so many external things to try to satisfy the emptiness within myself. So these are two things. In the world today, we need gostiyanandis to help as instruments of compassion to the world.
The young lady in the center here.
I wanted to ask you, what do you suggest to us to understand which path we should take amongst these two?
Among the two?
But you just said like there are different kind of way of expressing the spiritual connection. So you can suggest us how to find our special one.
If we are sincere and we associate with people who are sincere, that is revealed to us. But to be in this world but not of this world, in many ways is more difficult. But in many ways, it's more practical and congenial to most people.
Yes.
In the first part, when you were saying that we should reach to our core and find God, and then like have love for others. I was just wondering, are you saying that if we're not religious, we're not capable of the purest form of love? Was that your point or not?
If we don't connect to the eternal nature of our true self, our soul, and if we don't really connect to the grace of God, which is within all of us, which is that deepest, highest power of love, then we're not living according to our potential. To be good and to be kind and to be nice on a relative level is piety. It's goodness, which is good. But to actually go deeper, where we can actually be instruments of that eternal nature of love, that takes spiritual purification. So it's a question of how deep we want to go. In our tradition, we chant these names of God for this purpose, to make that connection. We have this mantra, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. There are many mantras. Man means the mind, and Trayate or Tra means to liberate, to purify the mind. to get the dust off the mirror of the mind. And this Maha Mantra, and there are many names of God, it actually connects us to that deep, eternal, spiritual essence of the dormant love that is our true nature. And that empowers us in a way that is beyond time and beyond death. And whether we call it, because religion is sometimes so misunderstood in this world, but the actual Latin word religion, it comes from the word religio, which means to bind us back to our essence. And the word yoga means to reconnect us, to reunite us with our essence. So what's important, whether we call it yoga or religion or spirituality, what's important is that we're reconnecting with our essence and being empowered by that grace in whatever we may be doing. Janavi Devi, she's a beautiful, virtual soul, violin player, dancer, and singer. And the beautiful skills she has, tries to uplift people's consciousness without expecting anything in return. It's just beautiful. Whatever talents we have can be beautiful ornaments to our devotion. Does that answer your question?
And we have another question just here. Young lady.
Yes, I was just wondering if spirituality is within all of us, and it's sort of and it's our essence in a way. Is it possible that that some people could be unspiritual? Because there are some people, if you ask them, do you believe in anything, or do you have some form of spirituality? They'll say no. And do you think that that's possible? That maybe there are just people who are not spiritual? It's a question I ask.
There's people who are forgetful of their spirituality. And spiritual paths are to remind us of what we've forgotten. My beloved Guru, Srila Prabhupada, when he first came to England, he was asked, "Why have you come here? We have our culture, we have our religion, why have you come here?" And Srila Prabhupada replied that you British people, you controlled India for almost 2 centuries. And you practically all the treasures of India you took to England. He said, but the greatest treasure of India is its spiritual culture. And you forgot to take that back to England. So I've come to give to you what you forgot to take from me.
We've time for one more question, but we've had quite a number of young ladies, so we'll have this young gentleman here.
One of my favorite quotes is, "To be yourself in a world that's constantly trying to make you into something else is the greatest accomplishment." I was just wondering, how would you define the words "to be yourself"?
All the questions are beautiful, thank you. We have various levels of selves. This body is our self, yes, but it's ever changing. It's like at one time you're a little baby, and now you're a very different body than your baby. And then the mind is a self, our thinking process. When you're a baby, you're thinking of the milk of your mother. When was the last time you thought of the milk of your mother? So now your mind is very much different. So it's always changing. So that's another self, the body, the mind, and there's also the witness that's actually experiencing life through all the changes of the body and mind. And that's the Atma. Atma means the eternal self, the true self. And to actually understand ourself in that way is the highest truth. And the world around us could facilitate living by that virtue, assist us in finding our true self. In a highly elevated culture or society, the way we do business, the way we do governments, the way we raise our families, it actually is in pursuance of living in harmony with our true self, with God. But unfortunately, so often in this world, for the purpose of profit and power and whatever else, there's so many ways we're trying to be exploited, discriminated, and taken away from that, distracted from that. Last year I did a similar conversation as with Professor Chan. I did with Dr. Cornell West at Princeton University. And he said something that I really liked. He said, today's world, we are constantly being bombarded by weapons of mass distraction. We're being distracted. But as the Bible says, to live in this world but not of this world means to really cultivate an awareness and help each other to cultivate that awareness of who our true self is. And then live within this world with those values. That is an activism that can make great change. And we all have that opportunity. Because real happiness is the life of fulfillment. Fulfillment comes when we're really living the values that we hold sacred.
Ladies and gentlemen, Swamiji, whenever he travels, enjoys most when he's able to have one-on-one conversations with people who've come to speak to him and speak with him and to share experiences with them. And so it's been very, very important to ensure that there is some one-on-one time for you, both here at the front of the lecture theatre and a little bit later on with the food and the other refreshment that's out there in the foyer. So what I want to do now is to bring this formal part of the proceedings to a close so that the informal interaction can begin. But before we do that, I think that we should show our appreciation to Swamiji for coming to talk to us.